The morning Cody Farrell climbed down into the ravine alone. He was 9 years old. His boots were 2 sizes too big, and there was nobody in the world who knew where he was. He had woken before his mother, before the dogs, before the light had fully decided whether it was going to come at all. He had pulled on those boots in the dark, his father's old work boots that he kept under his own bed because they smelled like the barn and saddle soap and something else he could not name. Something warm and specific to a particular person that he had never been able to identify, but that made him feel. Wearing them as if his father were somehow still in the house even when he wasn't. He laced them without turning on the light, because turning on the light felt too loud for what the morning was. Then he had walked out the back door without making a sound, because he had heard Dusty the night before, not a whinny. When the thunder is close and the smell of lightning has gotten into the barn air, something lower than that. Horses make sounds in storms. The thunder was close. Everything was fine. He got back into bed and pulled the covers to his chin and stared at the ceiling in the dark. He had not slept again. The sound stayed in him through the night the way small wrong things stay. Not loud enough to be an emergency, but persistent enough that his mind kept returning to it, testing its edges, measuring it against what he knew about horses and storms, and finding it a degree off. By 3 in the morning, he had stopped trying to rationalize it. By 4, he had accepted that he was not going to sleep. By the time the darkness began to thin, he was already planning the route to the barn. He got up. He pulled on the boots. Everything cold and dripping and heavy. He stood on the porch for a moment and listened. The eaves were dripping onto the boards. The yard lamp was ringed with haze. The dark shapes of the outbuildings were just beginning to separate themselves from the general dark, taking on edges. He walked to the barn first. Dusty's stall was empty. Not just vacant the way a stall is during the day when a horse is out in the pasture. The gate standing open at an angle that meant it had been pushed from the inside with force. There was mud on the stall floor that was not there the night before. Fresh mud, still wet, tracking toward the open gate and the barn door, and then continuing out into the yard. Cody stood in the empty stall, and the cold moved through him in a specific way. He thought about his father. He thought about the sound from the window. The combination of pace and eye contact that meant this is not a suggestion. This is something I need you to hold on to. The ravine ran along the eastern fence line where the land dropped away from the ridge, a deep scar left from some ancient hillside collapse. And after rain, the ground near its edge was soft and unreliable, and the old wire along it could shift, could come loose from posts, could lie invisible in wet grass until you were already in it. Cody followed the mud tracks out of the barn. That smell came up from the east, warm hide and river mud, and something metallic underneath it that tightened his chest the same way the sound through the window had tightened it. And he was already moving toward the fence line before he had consciously decided to move. His legs carrying information, his brain was still working through. Above the fast gray creek running high and loud from the storm. One foreleg was tangled in the collapsed wire. 2 tight loops wound around the lower leg. That look, there are moments that go in deep and stay. Cody would carry that look for the rest of his life. The particular quality of Dusty's eye, finding him in the thin light and holding there, still, exhausted, and certain. He did not call his mother. He would think about that decision at many ages and understand it differently each time. At 9, it was the instinct of a rancher's son, the application of what his father had taught him. A rancher looks at what he has and works the problem. At 20, it would look like pride. At 30, it would look like love, the specific thing children do when they need to protect the person they need most. And the only tool they have is competence. He found the way down 30 feet to the left, where the ravine wall had eroded into something close to a path. Deep footholds cut into the clay at some long past point, partially filled in by rain and time but still usable. He descended facing the wall, hands flat against the cold clay, testing each foothold before committing weight. The ledge at the bottom was wider than it had appeared from above. Dusty had maneuvered himself into the most protected corner where the ravine wall curved and the ground was hardest. Cody noticed this with the specific attention of someone who had been taught to notice it. Even in pain, even after a night of fear and struggling, the horse had found the best ground to wait on. He approached at an angle, low and slow, talking the whole time. About the weather, about the apple on the stall board, about the creak and the sound it made. He kept his hands visible, and his movements smooth and his voice steady, and by the time he was close enough to touch the horse's flank, Dusty's breathing had changed. Still exhausted, but no longer shallow with fear. Receiving him, he examined the wire. The first loop, lower on the leg, had cinched into the skin above the fetlock, a narrow dark channel where the wire had worked in during the night's struggles. Not deep, but not nothing. The second loop was higher, and actually slightly looser, wound more broadly, possibly because of its position during the struggling. He thought about this with the methodical patience his father had taught him, which was not about being slow, but about being right the first time, instead of fast the wrong way. He did not have wire cutters. He had his belt, his knife, and his hands. The lower loop was going to need the blade. He started with the upper one. He kept talking while he worked. He told him about a dream he'd had once about a river full of silver fish, so thick you could walk on them. He talked about everything and nothing, keeping his voice in the range of reassurance. And each time Dusty flinched, he stopped and waited and started again. The loop moved by millimeters, a fraction at a time over 20 minutes, but it came free. He allowed himself one moment of relief, forehead briefly against the horse's flank, eyes closed. Then he moved to the lower loop. The knife his father had given him last spring was a fixed blade, about because she had opinions about knives and 9-year-olds that his father understood and mostly respected, and on this one point had decided to address differently. He had said, "This is a tool, not a toy. Treat it like the difference matters." Wire was not what the blade was designed for. The rust made it worse. He worked the blade into the twist of the loop and sawed with steady pressure, not fast. His knuckles were scraped. His hands hurt from the cold and the gripping. He did not stop. The loop gave on the fourth attempt. He sat back hard in the mud, the release of tension so sudden it threw him backward. He sat there for a moment, the shaking in his hands that had been controlled all morning now running free because it no longer needed to be controlled. Dusty gathered himself slowly, the way horses do when they are uncertain of their own body, assessing each limb before loading it. He pressed himself upright in stages and finally stood, all 4 legs under him. Cody pressed his face into the horse's neck and let himself shake for another 30 seconds. Not crying, but adjacent to it, the kind of close that has no good name. The horse stood completely still and let him. Then Dusty moved, not toward the footholds in the ravine wall, not toward home. He turned his head east toward the ridge where the feral property ended and the national forest began, and stood with his ears forward and his nostrils working in slow, deliberate pulls, and did not look at Cody. Cody looked at the ridge, trees at the crest, dark and heavy with rain, mist sitting in the folds of the hillside. Nothing moving, just the ridge and the pale sky and the silence of a landscape catching its breath after a night of storm. He looked back at the horse. This is the moment that people would ask him about for years. Adults who heard the story would always want to know what it felt like, what he was thinking, whether he was afraid. He would never have a clean answer for them because the answer was not clean. It was multiple things happening at once that never fully separated into named feelings. He was afraid, yes. Years old, and his father had been gone for 2 days, and his horse was staring east like something out there needed to be found. And he had a line in his head that would not get out of it. His father had said it 2 mornings ago in the barn. Said it out of context, or what seemed like out of context, after checking the saddlebag without looking up. If anything ever goes wrong, trust the horse. Not the weather, not the neighbors, not your mother. The horse. And then he had looked up, and his eyes had done that thing they did when something was serious. Cody had not told his mother about that. He had understood, in the way children understand things they cannot articulate, that it was not for the kitchen that morning. The kitchen that morning had been full of the particular heavy air of something unfinished between his parents, and he had moved through it carefully for months, and he had not added this to it. He held it now. He found a way out of the ravine 50 yards downstream, where the wall had slumped over years into something negotiable, and they came up together into the gray morning. Cody first, and then Dusty up the gradual slope, the horse testing the left leg on each step, but finding it functional. Cody tore a strip from the hem of his undershirt and wrapped the worst of the cuts below the fetlock, tying it off with the deliberate care of someone who has been taught that this matters. Then he looked up, and the horse was already walking east. He stood at the fence line of the property for a real minute. Not a metaphorical hesitation, but an actual 60 seconds, the size of the foothills against the size of a boy. October and altitude, and the cold they would build all day. He was not equipped for an expedition, and he knew it. But his father had been gone 2 days. His father had said, "Trust the horse." His horse was moving toward where his father had last been going. He climbed through the fence. From the outside, Reeve was what you expected of a 4th-generation Wyoming rancher. Quiet, capable, economical with words. The kind of man who showed up and kept showing up without requiring recognition for it. That living with Reeve was like living with a person who was always present and somehow always withholding. She had apologized for saying it. What those who knew him from the outside did not know was the weight he carried. Not the ranch, not the debt, was a fear that had been with him so long it had become structural. His own father, Glenn Farrell, had died 9 years ago at 63 of a heart nobody had known was bad. Glenn had been the type of man who expressed love through labor, who showed up, who fixed things, who was present without ever being verbal about what that presence meant. And Glenn had loved Reeve with the ferocity of a man who did not know how to say so. And Reeve had known it, had always known it. But Glenn had died without ever looking at his son and saying the words directly. And I am proud of you in this specific way that means something, and not just the reflexive kind. And Reeve had carried that ungiven thing for 9 years. Had mostly been different, or tried to be, but there was a particular economy that ranch life demanded of a man's emotional vocabulary, a compression of expression that had been trained into him by 40 years of that life, and it worked against him when the words needed to be said. He could not find the words, so he had written it down. He had written it in the barn before anyone was up, at the table in the tack room with the single hanging bulb and the barn sounds around him. And he had written to Cody about what his son was, not in the generalities a father sometimes reaches for, but in the specific way, seen himself at that age, and had understood something about continuity, about a thing being passed forward. He had written about the horse, the whole page Mora would later read to him, about what he had observed in Dusty's relationship with Cody over 3 years of daily proximity. He had written to Mora, too, in the pages that followed. He had tried to write the version of himself that existed before the compression, before the years had trained him out of it. He had not succeeded entirely, but he had gotten closer than he ever had in person. And then he had put the letter in an envelope and put Cody's name on it and slipped it into the bottom of the saddlebag. He had told himself he might say it all out loud after the fence check. that the letter might stay in the bag forever, and he would find his way to the words directly. Or that if something happened, if anything ever went wrong, it would be there. He had not planned on the storm. He had ridden the east fence line in far worse weather than that morning had been promising, and he knew every yard of that terrain. The ride out had been fine, the storm still 40 miles back, according to what the morning sky said, the fence line unremarkable, except for the expected wear of a wet autumn. He had found the leaning post near the granite outcropping, the one he had been planning to address before the ground froze, and he had dismounted and tied Dusty's reins to a section of standing fence nearby and gone in to look at the post. The deer blind against the rock face had been there for years. He had never thought of it as anything but furniture of the landscape, a relic of the property's earlier use. Low weathered lumber roofed with corrugated metal, built into the base of the outcropping at some point by someone who had needed a place to wait without being seen. He had not thought about the rock above it, had not thought about the drought-loosened soil on the slope above the granite shelf, had not thought about what a night of hard rain does to ground that has been dry for 3 years. He heard it before he saw it, a sound like the earth making a decision. But the edge of it caught the corner of the blind's roof, and the torque of that connection sent one of the support beams sideways and then down, and Reeve was not fast enough, and the beam came down across his left leg and pinned him against the rock face. He lay still for a moment, assessing. The leg was not broken. He could move his foot, could feel the deep bruised ache of the weight, but not the specific wrongness of broken bone. Pinned, yes. Unable to shift the beam, yes, though he tried for a long time before admitting it. The rain began again above him, finding the gaps in the collapsed roof, soaking through his jacket, and he understood that October in Wyoming is not the kind of October where being wet and immobile is an inconvenience. It was a problem. It would become a serious problem by nightfall. Dusty had not bolted. That was the first thing he noticed, when the shock of the moment cleared enough to let him notice things. The horse had startled at the crash, had clearly pulled hard against the reins. He could see the damage to the fence post from where he lay, the wood strained and bent. But the post had held, and the reins had held, and Dusty was still there, 15 feet away, standing in the rain with his ears back, watching. Reeve called out for a long time. He called into the rain and the wind and the silence of the ridge, knowing as he called that they were too far from the house, too far from the road, the sound scattering in every direction without finding purchase. He called until his voice was rough. Then he stopped and thought, if anything ever goes wrong, trust the horse. He had said it because he meant it. He had said it, and he had meant it, and now he was lying under a beam in the rain, and Dusty was still there, and Cody was somewhere on the other side of the ridge. He talked to the horse, not commands, not the working language of direction. The other kind, the kind you use in the dark when you need something alive to hear you. He said Cody's name twice, out loud, into the rain. Dusty turned his head at the sound of it. Reeve watched the horse for a long time. He said, stay. A decision rather than a process, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. Reeve kept himself focused on the things he could control, which was staying conscious and keeping his core muscles working and not letting the cold tell him stories about the future. He had seen men in worse positions. He had survived worse conditions. Dusty stayed, all through the night, and the rain, and then the cold after the rain. The horse stood on the end of his reins and did not bolt and did not give up. Reeve watched him between the long intervals when he had to close his eyes and simply endure. And every time he opened them, the horse was there, a dark shape against the dark, standing with the patience of an animal who understands that there is nothing to do but wait for the person who is coming. As something established and not open for revision, Cody will come. He has been trained for this moment his whole life without either of us knowing That's what we were doing. Dawn came the way dawn always comes after a bad night, with a gradualism that seems cruel at first, and then gracious when it finally arrives. And then Cody came over the rise. Cody had eaten in the way children eat when they are aware of the atmosphere in a room, and are trying not to add to it, quickly and quietly, and without comment. She had put Cody to bed. She had sat in the kitchen. She had done the things you do when you are waiting. She had washed dishes. She had looked at the same paragraph of a book 4 times without retaining it. She had checked her phone for a message that was not there. She told herself he had gone farther than expected, that he was sheltering somewhere sensible and would be in touch when he could. She told herself all of this with the specific effort of a person who no longer entirely believes the stories she is telling herself. Because the truth was that she had been afraid for a year that some morning he would leave and not come back. Not because she believed him to be that kind of man in the deliberate, calculated sense, would simply become too much, and he would make a decision that had been building without either of them saying its name. She had not called anyone. She would think about that for years. She had the Brecken's number in her phone. She had Reeves' brother. She had the non-emergency line for the county sheriff that the county ranchers all knew. She had not called any of them because calling would have made the absence official in a way she was not ready to make it. She had sat with her wrong story all night. She did not know about the far fence line, and she would understand it not as failure, but as the geometry of a family under stress, the way information pools in unexpected places. She found the boots at 5 in the morning. Cody's small pair, the ones that should have been under his bed, sitting on the porch where he had considered wearing them and then chosen his father's instead. She found the back door unlocked. She did not panic. She was a rancher's wife, and she did not panic. She went methodical, the way Reeve would have gone, checking the barn first, finding it orderly except for the open saddlebag peg and the bandaging supplies pulled out and some missing, without having all the information that her son had gone after her husband, and that she had sat with a wrong story all night while her son had been doing the work of a man. She set down the mug. She crossed the yard and she went past Cody, who stepped back to give her what she needed, because he was 9 years old and he understood more than any 9-year-old. She went to Reeve and she stood in front of him and looked at his face, at the color of a man who had been cold and wet for a long time. She said, "You should have told me where you were going." He said, "You're right." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw and held it there. He unsaddled Dusty with the methodical respect his father had taught him, checking everything in order, finding the cuts already slightly better than they had been at the bottom of the ravine, cleaning them with the antiseptic from the kit and wrapping them properly. He gave water and hay and the apple. He was checking the bandage when he opened the saddlebag. Habit. His father's voice. Always unsaddle clean, check the bags, leave the tack in order. He opened the flap and went through the contents, restoring them to proper arrangement, and at the bottom, beneath the first aid items and the folded emergency blanket, he found the envelope, his name, his father's handwriting. He held it. The light was coming through the barn doors in the October way, flat and pale and specific, and Dusty was eating quietly behind him. And he could hear the birds starting up outside, the first sounds of a morning that had decided to continue after all. Placed here on Tuesday morning before his father rode out, which meant it was not a message from crisis, but something that had been there all along, waiting for the timing that would make it findable. He set it on the shelf. He finished with the horse. When he came inside, his parents were in the kitchen together, and his mother was at the counter with her back to the room. The kitchen air was different from before. Not fixed, not resolved, not the bright, simple air of a problem solved, but different, altered, as if something had moved slightly to one side and left more room. He put the envelope on the table. His father looked at it. He looked at Cody, and then at Mara's back. His mother turned around. She said, "What is that?" His father said, "Something I wrote." "For who?" A pause. "For Cody first," he said. "I think for both of you." She came to the table. She looked at the envelope, and at Reeve, and at the envelope again, and picked it up. His father's compressed handwriting, dense on the blue-lined paper, and she began to read. She read standing. She turned the first page without looking up. She stopped at a line on the second page and read it again, and her hands were doing something they were doing on their own that had nothing to do with decisions she was making. She kept reading. The kitchen was very quiet while she read. Her eyes were wet. She did not try to manage it. She said, "He wrote you almost a whole page about the horse." His father was looking at the window above the sink. He had looked at that window 10,000 mornings. "I should have said all of this out loud," he said. "Just yes." The acknowledgement of a true thing, which was not the same as agreement, but was related to it, and which was, Cody would understand years later, the beginning of an honest conversation rather than the end of one. His father looked at him then, looked at the oversized boots and the mud still drying on his jacket and his hands. He said, "You're going to tell me the whole story." Cody pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. He told him everything. The sound, the empty stall, the tracks in the mud, the descent into the ravine, the wire and the knife, and the specific logic of working the upper loop by hand before cutting the lower one. His father listened with the full attention he brought to things that mattered, which was complete, which missed nothing, which was one of the things about him that was never in question. When Cody finished, his father was quiet for a moment. He said, "You thought your way through every part of it. The days after were not simple. 2 weeks of Reeve off full load while the bruising resolved, which was 2 weeks the property could not easily absorb. But the letter was there. Mora kept it in the top drawer of the dresser, under the ordinary accumulations of a life. She did not take it out often. But there was a night in February, 3 months later, when she could not sleep, when she got up in the dark and sat on the edge of the bed and read it again by the light of her phone. And she read the passage about Cody, and she read the passage about Dusty, and she sat with each one. The last lines of the Cody passage read, "He is braver than I gave him the chance to be. He is braver than I knew how to say." I don't know if horses understand what they carry, but I think Dusty has always known what this boy was. I think he knew it before I found the words. She folded the letter and sat in the dark for a long time. Reeve learned to say the words, not in a flood, not all at once, not as the dramatic conversion of a man who has been shown the light. In the gradual, specific way of someone dismantling a habit that was built over decades, one instance at a time. He said them at the dinner table. He said them in the barn in the morning when it was just him and Cody in the early light. Was no reason to say them, except that they were true and he had them to give. He was not always smooth about it. Sometimes the words came out slightly wrong, slightly off the timing, in the compressed, imprecise way of a man still learning the syntax. But they came, and Mara and Cody both understood what they were hearing, which was not the perfection of expression, but the attempt of expression, which meant more than the perfection would have. Cody came to the barn every morning through the winter. He cleaned and fed and talked. Dusty's leg healed clean. By spring, you had to know exactly where to look to find the scar. And if you did look, it was there. A slightly lighter seam on the skin, above the fetlock, where the new tissue had come in different from the old. But if you knew where to look, it was there. On a morning in November, 6 weeks after the deer blind and the storm, Cody was in the barn early when he remembered the saddlebag. At the very bottom, under everything else, he found a slip of paper folded twice. Not an envelope. He always does. Dusty eating from the hay net with the unhurried focus of an animal at peace, and he was very still for a long time. 6 words, written before the storm, before the beam, before any of it, set in the saddlebag alongside the letter, a smaller thing, almost a postscript, except that it was not a postscript, it was the point. He folded the paper along its original creases and put it in his shirt pocket. He wore it there all that day, through school, through dinner, through the evening. At bedtime, he took it out and set it on the knitstand beside the lamp, and in the morning, he put it back in his pocket. He put it in a pocket every day for years. At some point, he moved it from shirt pocket to the front pocket of every pair of jeans he owned. A deliberate migration, conscious, because jeans were what he wore every day, and shirt pockets changed. He wore it through high school. He wore it through a year away at an agricultural college in Laramie, where he was homesick in the specific way of someone whose home is not a place, but the particular combination of a place and a horse, and a way of being in the morning before anyone else is up. He would have horses his whole life. He would have good ones. None of them would be dusty, not in the way that Dusty was. The way a first thing is always its own category. But he would look for something in each of them, and he would find something of it in each one, because that quality is not the property of one horse. It is what happens in the space between a person and an animal when both of them have been paying attention long enough. What it is precisely, nobody has satisfactorily explained. Reeve Farrell would sometimes come into the barn in the morning and find Cody already there, already in conversation with the horse, and he would stand at the door for a moment without being noticed, watching his son, and he would think about the letter in the saddlebag and the slip of paper and the morning. He had been pinned under a beam in the rain and had said his son's name out loud and watched the horse's head turn at the sound. He would stand there and he would feel the particular weight of something given and received, the weight of something that passed between people and animals and time. And after a while, he would step into the barn and put his hand on his son's shoulder and say nothing. And Cody would say nothing, and they would just be there together in the morning light with the horse. There are families that are held together by the things they say, and there are families that are held together by the things they discover they have always been carrying for each other. And one morning in October, in a barn outside of Cheyenne, a 9-year-old boy in oversized boots held a folded slip of paper against his chest, pressed his forehead against a horse's warm neck, and understood without words what his father had been trying to say his whole life. He will find you. He always does. Cody Farrell carried that. He carried it the way you carry something that was always yours, that was placed in your hands before you knew you would need it, that waited in the bottom of a saddlebag in the dark for the morning that was always coming. Some things were said long before the words arrived,